the single word title for today. And if you've got the handout, I'm going to try to carry us all through that this morning. We kind of depend on the PowerPoint sometimes to help us fill out the handout, and that way we don't get dragged down too much, or at least hopefully I don't, and trying to make sure all the words get filled in. And so your job this morning is to fill in the words. My job is to try to help you make sure you have those. And if you don't, at the end of the sermon, if you don't have all the blanks filled in, too bad, okay? You can talk to somebody else. Don't talk to me after the sermon, okay? I'm done. No, I'm mostly kidding about most of that. But I'm thankful this morning that I have the opportunity for us to think about the problem, and that is the first word on your handout, right? Okay? Problem, thorns. Now, I don't know how much of a problem it really is out here from a agricultural standpoint. What I think of as thorns. Now, I've been in Oklahoma a decade or a little more now, but when I think about thorns, I think of more of what I experienced growing up, playing in the woods. We don't really even have that much woods in this part of Oklahoma, okay? But I think about the briar patches and the thick clumps that would, if you didn't clean out your woods, would take over. And you, as a kid trying to run through those and playing manhunt and hide and go seek and a few other things, those could be a very uncomfortable experience. But we still deal with them out here, and we deal with other things that are similar. We deal with a smaller issue out here. And they're smaller in their individual size, but the impact, the problem can be just as bad. I'm thinking about those things that everybody wants to get rid of in their yards. Those grass burrs or spurs. People call them different things, but you know what I'm talking about, all right? And they get in your socks, and if you're wearing tennis shoes, they get all over your ties. I mean, it's not a fun experience. And so we could look at a number of different types of plants and things this morning that we might label under that overarching word thorn or thorns. And we'd have to say, yes, they can be a problem. I don't know if we want to go back and say it all goes back to Genesis 3 and the curse there or what, but thorns are not fun. But that isn't the meaning of our word, primary meaning of our term thorns for this morning. Instead, we're thinking about the thorns of life. Things in life that poke at us. The things in life that make us bleed. Whether it's actual physical blood, like some health issue or some injury, or it are things that stab deeper into our hearts, our emotions, and make us bleed in that deeper way. Thorns of life. And I stand here this morning as someone that looks out at people that I know some of your thorns. I know some of the thorns that I've personally experienced in my life. But here's the good part this morning. Good part, the takeaway this morning is that God is so great and so wise, so powerful, that God can use the thorns of our life, my thorns, your thorns. And here's these two words, okay? They both start with a G, so I made that part a little easy, maybe. But He can use them for His glory, people to see more of His grace, more of His power. And then and you might guess that one then, for our growth. His glory, my growth. Thorns are allowed by God to enter our lives in order for us to grow stronger as He, in the process, assuming we live the Christian life through those thorns, He gets the credit, He gets the glory. So we have this morning three terms. There are blanks for those terms on the handout twice. So if you get the three big ones, it starts with an A and then a D and a P, those are going to be the exact same terms under the conclusion. Okay, so I just wanted you to write a little more of the same words, and maybe that helps us get them in our head this morning. But I guess I'll go ahead and give them to you so you can cheat now. The words are arrogant, dependence, and perseverance. So if you can remember the ants there ending, then you're a long way to remembering the overall ideas for this or from this sermon. So arrogance, dependence, and perseverance. Let's take a look together. The first one then, arrogance. The reason for the word arrogance is that thorns are intended to bring us to our senses. It is easy for us to go through life. The easy thing is to go through life and be arrogant. Pride is perhaps the most common human problem. You sin in there, but pride might be the root of most, if not all, sins that we commit. For sure, intentional ones. Arrogance is defeated, or at least it can be defeated, by the thorns. Let's open up our Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. You might notice 1 through 7 on the notes there. That'll be our beginning reading for today. And the letter that the Holy Spirit inspires the Apostle Paul to write. We're getting near the end of the letter. Paul begins to boast. It starts back in chapter 11. In 2 Corinthians 11, if you begin at verse 23 and go through the end of the chapter, through verse 32, as we have it today, Paul makes quite a bit of boasting. But it's weird, okay? It's a parody of boasting, because what he lists are not things that we would boast about. They're not accomplishments and achievements and accolades and things of that nature. They're his problems, his concerns, his persecutions, his beatings, his shipwreck. It's all of these bad things that Paul is somehow boasting about. And that's where we are in 2 Corinthians 12. Shared all this with them. He's opened up, and now he continues in this way. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, he says, I must go on boasting. Though there is nothing to be gained by it, I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. Now it's like he's going to change it, and now that sounds more right. At least if you're talking about boasting, now that makes more sense. But you catch some of this language here. You feel the tone here where he says, I have to boast more, even though there's really nothing to it, but I'm going to go on and do it anyway. And then here's how he does that, starting in verse 2 now. He says, I know a man in Christ. It's like some of those social media posts where someone says, they ask about something, ask for some advice, or share a problem, a burden, and then they say, I'm asking for a friend. Okay, I suggest to you this morning that's what's happening here, is it actually is a part of Paul's humility in that he doesn't say it was him. But I think it's Paul, okay? And so I know somebody, I know this guy, asking for a friend. I know a man who in Christ 14 years ago was caught up into the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Here's what he says, I know, in verse 3, I know that this man was caught up into paradise. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And, verse 4, he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. Now, verse 5, on behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except, he says, of my weaknesses. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool. You get more of that back and forth language. You get more of that you find a few times in Paul's letters, where he uses this other form of rhetoric where he says, I could tell you about this, but I won't. And in the process, he does tell you. He just does it in a way where I could, but I won't, but I will. And here he says, I'm going to boast about this man. Even though I could myself, I wouldn't be foolish. I wouldn't be made a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. Verse 6 continues, but then the sentence now closes out, and he says, I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. And you might keep in mind as you read that last part that the previous boasting in chapter 11 are things that were fairly well known. Most of these things were of a public aspect. And so his shipwreck and his travels and his beatings, those things would have been somewhat known and made it through the grapevine of either the cultural gossip or even church gossip and that kind of activity. Here he says, I'm not going to boast about myself. And then look at verse 7. He says this, so, to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, what does it say? Thorn. Thorn. Thorn was given me in the flesh. He goes on to describe it as a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. And you read that right. He says that twice. Both sides of this statement about the thorn are encompassed or connected to becoming conceited. You've likely heard about Paul's thorn in the flesh. It is a fairly popular religious topic. It's a religious question often of what was this thorn, and that's on our thoughts for today as well. The context of Paul's thorn in the flesh was so that even the Apostle Paul, in all that he was, might not become arrogant or conceited. You mean that the Apostle Paul, there was the possibility, the potential there, even the Apostle Paul could become prideful? Yeah. And so if I begin to think that maybe this isn't an issue for me, maybe I don't have an arrogance problem, maybe I don't have an ego that it's a little on the large size, maybe I don't have a conceit problem where I think I'm more than I am and I'm full of myself. If I begin to think, I don't have that problem, I can't have that problem, then maybe, among a few other different things, maybe I might take a look at Paul. And if Paul could have that temptation, maybe I can. Part of the reason then that God allows thorns, part of the reason, not the only one, and that's beyond the scope of this text and this lesson, but part of the reason God permits bad things to enter our life is to humble us, to help us remember who we are and also who we aren't. Now, what is Paul's thorn in the flesh? That is the million-dollar question that unfortunately tends to cloud the real core issue of Paul's thorn in the flesh, humbling Paul. But let's read verse 10 for a moment. I do encourage you to read the rest of this paragraph where Jesus answers Paul's prayer and gives him this message about grace and power and weakness. That might be for another sermon. But look at verse 10 as a brief answer to the question, what is Paul's thorn? Is it a health problem? Is it a people problem? What is it? In verse 10, he gives us 4 categories of thorns. So it is likely that at least one of these, maybe even a combination of these categories, was Paul's specific thorn here. But he never tells us specifically. Verse 10 of 2 Corinthians 12, he says, for the sake of Christ then, I am content with, and here's your 4, weaknesses. And that could be a health issue. It could be a mental issue, an emotional struggle. In this context, these thorns are not sin issues. Keep that in mind. Jesus isn't saying your sin's okay. Don't try to overcome your sin. It's something that is entering Paul's life like a weakness. Insults that are listed here and insult. Hardships, thirdly. Those persecutions, those obstacles in his way, even in the previous chapter. And then persecutions and calamities. Other problems and troubles that brought difficulty, to say it lightly, into Paul's life. So there's those four categories of weaknesses. I think I counted weaknesses and in the four, so you'd have five. But I think that gives us some idea of the kind of thorns in mind here. And whether we want to think today of a diagnosis, whether we want to think today of a dysfunction in a family dynamic. We might think about someone who is facing extreme criticism. We might think about someone that is a single parent today and the struggle. The thoughts of, I just don't know if I can make it another day. I don't know if I can get another bill in the mail. I don't know. And when you go back to verse 7, Paul said, this thorn was harassing me. The language here, the grammar here is like it's a thorn that Satan is holding against Paul, and he just won't stop. Satan just keeps pressing and poking, stabbing at Paul. Like the thorn is a sword or a spear, and he keeps jabbing at Paul. Or he keeps jabbing at, and you put your name there today. But as always, in God's sovereignty, in God's knowledge, even though Satan is somehow involved here, he says it's a messenger of Satan. Satan is the one who ends up, as we might say, with the egg on his face. Because Satan doesn't want Paul, he doesn't want you to be humble. He celebrates when I am prideful. Because the goal here was humility. But it's like the thorns, as the story goes, are like the man, might have been a slave, who stands at the back of the chariot. As the Roman emperor or general is carried through the triumphal march in Rome, victorious over the enemies of Rome. And there's someone back there, and one of their jobs is to periodically whisper in the ear of the general, the conquering general, remember, you are mortal. You're mortal. It's like thorns of life are allowed by God in part to remind me of my mortality, my frailty, the fact that I'm not going to be on this earth forever, and the fact that I can't do it all. And maybe those thorns are there to say, be careful of your arrogance in life. Arrogance can be defeated in part by my problems. They humble us, don't they? We think we're on top of the world, and then our world comes crashing down. And if we respond appropriately, we might never be more humble than in those moments of trouble, arrogance. But that then is meant to lead us to this next word, dependence. Dependence. Go back to 2 Corinthians 12. We were at verse 7. We skipped down to verse 10. Let's look at that next verse, verse 8. As we ask this question then, where do you go? When those problems have brought you down, whether it is the stresses of life that daily add up, those little grass burrs that add up to a major problem, and then we just can't take it anymore. Or it is that message about the test results, or it is that relationship that we thought was going to last decades, and it's over. And it brings us down. And we get broken by it. by the thorns. Here we are on our knees. What do? You can stay there and wallow in that, and that can lead to depression and other dangers. You can get right back up and grit your teeth, clench your fist, and say, I got this. End up right back where you started. Or, maybe literally, if you're literally on your knees, you can do what Paul does. Let's read it now, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 8. He says, 3 times, and this does bear some parallel with Jesus' prayers in Gethsemane. 3 times I pleaded. Been there? You're pleading and begging. Those times when you might not even know really what to say, how to say it. You're just hurting. He says, I pleaded 3 times with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. Paul wasn't saying, I went to the Lord and I said, Lord, just help me through this. Give me the strength. Give me your grace. Here, Paul, like us, says, I went and I asked, take it away. I don't want the thorn. He pleads. It's a reminder today that it's okay, it's healthy to ask for God, I don't want this. Can you take it away? And I don't think this text teaches that the answer is always no, but it does teach there are times when the answer is no. There might even be a time and a place where we realize this isn't going to be something God is going to take away or allow to leave me, at least anytime soon. I might even change my prayers at some point. I'm not saying you have to, but I'm not saying you're going to get an answer like Paul does in this way, directly from Jesus. I don't think you're going to hear him say, no, my grace is sufficient. But it might be that we learn from Paul's own example. There are times when I might plead, and part of the reason that God is willing for that pain to happen to me is because it is meant and it allows me the opportunity, it almost forces me to turn to Him, to depend that much more on Him, on His daily overload of grace and care. To be like Joseph. It's going to be your name there, Joseph. In Genesis chapter 50, when his brothers are beginning to get that anxiety, what's going to happen? Dad's dead. Joseph is still in charge. All that we did to him, he hasn't forgotten about it. We haven't forgotten about it. And he says, I'm not going to do any harm to you. Why? He says, yeah, you meant it for evil. Satan here, he means it for evil. And the people that hurt us, people that insult us, the people that steal from us, the people that lie about us, they mean it for evil. Joseph says, I realize that God, in His providence, He meant it for good. And it looks like it's more insight into Joseph's heart then, but I think before that. He's saying this allowed all of these people to be saved and delivered from the famine and more, and our whole family now is together in Egypt. That's the part of the big picture Joseph's looking at. But Joseph, in those years, in slavery, in prison, he had to learn to depend. When he couldn't turn to anybody else, family, friends, employer, all of that's gone, to depend on God. It's a powerful example of a young man who goes through some of the worst in life. It's a Powerful example of the Apostle Paul, who gives up everything that we might think is valuable to live a life persecuted and in trouble, and on the run, to depend more on God. Arrogance, it can be defeated by thorns. Dependence grows by thorns. And this last one this morning, perseverance. Part of the outcome of thorns that cut us is that we get stronger to endure life. The outcome of thorns, of suffering, is how Paul words it in Romans 5. The outcome is endurance or perseverance. When I go through the thorns of life, during them, and when I do come out on the other side, assuming that it is something I'm able to get past at some point in life, I am that much stronger by His grace. It's like Job. There's Joseph, there's Paul, there's Job. And we see Satan at work there, and we see God, like with Paul, allowing Satan to torture Job. But as James writes, he says, one thing you know about Job is his steadfastness. And you know the end, the purpose of the Lord. We get that more information. We get more than Job himself did, really. And the compassion, he says, you know that of the Lord. It grows our spiritual muscles. And we have to work and try to survive sometimes through perils of life. The difference, the key here, is in how we respond. And that's going to be that last word there, other than the 3 repeated on your handout. How we respond. And then you'll notice react in parenthesis. Maybe that's the way to say it. It is whether I respond by being humbled, allowing it to humble me, arrogance defeated. I respond by dependence on God, and then my perseverance grows. Or I react and I get bitter. When the thorns of life come, sometimes we get bitter. We get mad, and then we get bitter. Sometimes that's when we decide, I don't know about this whole thing with walking with Jesus. It ain't working out like I thought it was going to. I thought it was going to be easy. And it's not. Sometimes the Christian walk is more difficult from a certain perspective than otherwise. That's why I need perseverance. But if I'm willing to look at thorns as a way to grow, to ask, what am I going to learn from this? How am I going to grow spiritually through this? Then I'll find perseverance as another, can we call them? I don't know if we want to call it a blessing, but another benefit of thorns. We've seen this morning 3 aspects of thorns. We've seen arrogance, the thorns break down. We've seen dependence that is required to get through this with God. And on the other side, perseverance as a blessing for us. Now, Gary's going to lead us in a song, and it is not just some tradition that we have. It is meant to be a call of our hearts and our minds and our voices to one another, an invitation to come and become a Christian, to come and be a better Christian today. But as we close, think about the old Greek story from Greek mythology of a man named Daedalus, and you might know his son's name, Icarus. And they're trapped on the island by the evil king. And as industrious and wise as the Daedalus is, he fashions those wings that allow Icarus and himself to escape. And you know the rest of the story. We have that saying, and still in our language, don't fly too close to the sun. Because Icarus sees how great it is, how beautiful it is. And despite his dad's warnings, he just gets higher and higher. And then he comes crashing down. It reminds us of these three things today. Don't fly too high. Arrogance. Listen, depend on your Father's instructions. Dependence. And have the long-term goal, full journey to the other side in mind. Perseverance. Would you come as we stand together and sing?